Hello, welcome back. Today is going to be my second video discussing Bitcoin and contrasting it with fiat money, and as a sort of the initial kind of primer on what I sort of see as a sort of the game theoretic element of increasing Bitcoin adoption. As we see more and more individuals, corporations and countries adopt this as a currency, it's important to sort of try and understand why are people choosing to use this thing, why are people becoming convinced of its merits as this sort of superior sounder form of money in comparison to the current monies that we use, the dollars, the pounds and euros and other cryptocurrencies. I think a good way to enter into this topic is to sort of elucidate a kind of understanding of what fiat money first and foremost is. And fiat, I think, is a sort of a Latin term for let it be done. And essentially what this kind of means is that the value of your dollar or your pound or your euro is it has value because the issuing authority says it does, and this is obviously different to past forms of money such as gold and other commodity metals that we use as money. Ever since 1971, which was the infamous Nixon shock, where Nixon, he came out and said temporarily ended the dollar peg to gold, such that people could no longer convert their dollars for gold. And there's a rich history as to what led up to that event. You obviously had the Vietnam, very expensive Vietnam that were preceding that, and sorry, my voice broke. And there were quite famous sort of moments where the French government were sending over warships to essentially try and convert their dollars for gold, but obviously because they were essentially skeptical that the US government had the gold to back up their dollar claims. And Nixon famously sort of attributed his unpegging of the dollar to gold as a way of countering the international money speculators who were attacking the dollar and stuff. But and I guess this is sort of you can look at this as a kind of the first case of where the dollar and the US government essentially defaulted on their monetary obligations. And ever since 1971, the global monetary sort of order has been a sort of a network of freely floating fiat currencies, currencies that are issued by central banks and governments and whatnot, and they were sort of competing, trading against one another. But in unpegging the currency from a sort of a commodity metal, obviously became detached from some kind of natural resource foundation, which gave governments and central banks the liberty to create more money for whatever purposes they saw as worthy. And that's quite a significant shift, and I guess not many people are really conscious of how their money is it's a this thing that can be created out of nothing. that isn't tethered to some kind of natural and scarce substrate. And I think an easy way of sort of looking at, this current monetary system that we have of competing fiat currencies is that we have this network of melting ice cubes, and I use this metaphor to get at how fiat currencies are often and always pretty much inherently inflationary. That is, year on year there is always an increase of more money coming into circulation, and this is why they're inflationary. And the dollar has sort of come to be the global reserve currency for a variety of different reasons. There's also the whole petrodollar system, which I won't go into here, but it's it has value as the slowest melting ice cube in the network of different ice cubes. But that doesn't mean that it isn't melting. That if you hold $1,000, that $1,000 will be worth less next year, because more and more dollars are being created out of nothing, which obviously is quite significant, I think, psychological and philosophical implications of having an inherently inflating currency, because it effectively cripples one's ability to save for the future. If you know that your money is going to be worth less, if your purchasing power is going to be significantly less in the future, that incentivizes you to consume now, and it disincentivizes people to save for a rainy day, to delay gratification. And this essentially ties into the whole notion of time preferences, and the economist Safadine Amos, who is most famous for writing the book The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, who's quite popular in the space. He uses the notion of time preference to get at this psychological dimension to how the form of money that we use affects us, affects the decisions that we make, affects the way that we coordinate our endeavours, how we live, essentially. And this whole element of time preference is tied into how does the value of your money change over time? Does your money increase in value, or does it decrease in value? I mean, if your money increases in value, you're disincentivized in that moment to spend it, to consume it. You're more incentivized to save for the future, because you know that your purchasing power will be greater in the future. And it's whilst many people in sort of more developed countries with less obviously corrupt monetary situations, our money sort of inflating, it's maybe not really immediately obvious to us if it's, say, 2% or 3%, 5%, whatever. But when it becomes significantly higher, say you get inflation rates of 10, 20, 40, 50, whatever, 100%, or even more than that, if you're, if you're in Weimar kind of conditions, the Weimar Republic is obviously a famous historical example of, a hyperinflation occurring to Germany, which even before that was thought to be quite a developed country, with a rich, a rich, it's a rich culture, rich industry and whatnot, and we can see how even in a country that is thought to be developed, a hyperinflation, a total debasement of money can absolutely cripple a society. And it's important to look at history when thinking about the present, because history does often rhyme. And I can't help but see these trends becoming more and more apparent in the current future. We hear stuff about the cost of living crisis following, obviously the COVID pandemic, and in a lot of the quote-unquote explanations to explain these changing and increasingly inflationary environments, you often see explanations of, it's because of the war, or because of this energy crisis, or that thing. And that's not to say that these events do not have effects upon the monetary environment. They obviously do, but they are kind of pseudo superficial explanations which ignore the very deep fundamental drivers of inflation, which is the fact that our money is issued by a centralized authority that we trust, but it is their incentive to constantly increase the money supply. Like I said in the last episode, money, inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And, when you have your money that is completely untethered to nature, it is entirely, the value of it is a kind of confidence gain. It's a kind of trust in a centralized node, a centralized authority. Essentially, you've got to ask the question, what happens when trust is eroded? What happens when the confidence gain, when people lose confidence in that country, or that central bank, that whatever, because, the dollar obviously has no intrinsic value. And that's the reason why, $1,000 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, it was worth significantly more back then. You had more purchasing power, but now, it's significantly less. And this is obviously a natural progression of the shift to using fiat currencies. And I'm sort of, it's quite a deep point that I'm trying to sort of convey, because money is something that is very fundamental to the way human beings interact with one another. And there's a whole question of, if you have a monetary system that is inherently by design meant to erode your capacity to save and plan for the future, how does that over time change a society? How does that change a civilization? I think there are obvious reasons for why fiat currencies were adopted in preference against commodity metals like gold. Gold it's very difficult to move. Whilst gold, you can sort of store your purchasing power across time. It doesn't have the same spatial flexibility. It costs a lot of money for me to send gold to a place across the globe, and there's a whole cost of security and whatnot. But so there were sort of obviously reasons why governments were incentivized to shift towards a fiat kind of monetary system. But I think there are significant issues, particularly in the fact that there's incentives to incentives for debasement. And monetary debasement is something that's happened a lot throughout history. It happened with the Roman Empire as well, with both with coin clippings, for example, where the central issuing authority would sort of would clip gold off coins and then sell it as the previous value, even though it had less gold in. So monetary debasement isn't a new phenomenon, and it's obviously happening now. Just look at inflation, just look at the cost of your food, look at the cost of housing, and like I said in my previous episode, in academic and orthodox economics, inflation is just taken as an unquestioned assumption, and it's weird to me, really. And I guess sort of it's an interesting point about how a lot of the ways that paradigm shifts happen, it comes by asking the simplest kind of questions, or asking almost questioning those assumptions that are just taken as obvious. And I think Bitcoin as a monetary technology that emerged 2008 out of the 2008 financial crisis, there were it's sort of the technology sort of it combined a bunch of different developments in cryptography and whatnot to create a sort of a new thing, a new project, a kind of a peer-to-peer network of exchanging value, and it's important to see how in the very early days of the development of the Bitcoin network, it probably was it was less obvious that it was going to succeed, but the interesting thing about these sort of things is that as they get older, as they get more developed, the network becomes dispersed across the globe, across increasing numbers of participants, as a whole kind of thing known as the Lindy effect, which is kind of like speaks to how as things persist more over time and develop, their past history of development becomes a more and more confident predictor of their future success. And I would say that after 15, nearly 16 years of development of the Bitcoin network, people aren't paying more attention to it. The previous skeptical arguments, which sort of supposing that it's a mere bubble, that it's going to crash, and it's a very natural counter argument to something that's new. But as something persists over time, there are like 15-year-olds, for example, who there's never been a time when there wasn't Bitcoin in their life. So it's going to be obviously much more intuitive, much more natural, much more obvious to them. And I suppose there are more hurdles for older people who are sort of have this sort of very deep ingrained association of money with dollars, with paper notes, these symbolic cultural artifacts, which is what they are. You look at them, they have all sorts of pictures, all sorts of symbols to kind of create the aura of legitimacy, but they're not really legitimate, because you can create more and more out of nothing. But the principal property of Bitcoin is its absolute scarcity, and as well it's inherent to the Bitcoin mining process, the process by which new Bitcoins are created. There is a natural limit of computational work, of a certain degree of energy expenditure, and this is inherent in the whole proof of work process. proof of work means that you cannot create a Bitcoin without using energy. And the energy dimension to Bitcoin is so frequently misunderstood. It's some, and this is this ties into where you have other cryptocurrencies using proof of stake, which it's meant to reduce the energy expenditure and stuff like that. Energy use is sort of it's for some people it's an inherent kind of negative association with it, and I'm not going to go too deep into the whole energy side of Bitcoin, because it's much more complex than I can produce in the next however long I continue on. But an important thing to think about is that your organism uses energy. Everything that you see of value that you use is a product of energy expenditure. And so there's a whole question of like, okay, the amount of energy expenditure that is required, expended in producing a new dollar, it's you can produce them out of nothing, and it's kind of like, and this ties into particularly the evolution of monies, and how harder monies, as they're called, often outcompete easier monies. And principally you can think of them as how much energy do I need to put in to produce this sort of thing, and obviously commodity metals sort of outcompeted the use of seashells as forms of money and whatnot, and obviously dollars outcompeted other competing fiat currencies where their supply increased significantly much more relative to them. So and you see this a lot in countries where they have their national currency is hyperinflationary. They'll tend to have a preference for the dollar relative to their own currency, and this ties back into the whole melting ice cubes point that I made at the start about how the network of competing fiat currencies are, you can think of them as a network of melting ice cubes. Some melt faster than others. Some are superior to others in terms of storing your purchasing power over time, but it doesn't mean that they aren't melting. It doesn't mean that it's easy to produce more of them. But in contrast to Bitcoin, where it is not easy to produce more Bitcoins, that scarcity makes it makes it much more superior as a store of value, as a way to store one's purchasing power over time, such that it isn't debased by a centralized authority issuing more. So I hope that's been slightly informative. I'm going to be continuing to think about Bitcoin more. I mean, it's the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it's people do often describe it as a rabbit hole that doesn't have a clear bottom. It's I guess sort of whilst I am sort of creating these videos to try and teach and articulate what I've learned, I still very much feel like a student in this space, and I probably will continue to be a student my entire lifetime, I suppose. There's always more to learn, there's always more to evaluate, to question, and so anyways, I realise I haven't really gone too much into the game theory of adoption, but I think as a small primer for the next video I make, I think particularly in the realm of adoption, the Streisand effect is particularly relevant, and I think the Streisand effect relates to some kind of event involving Barbra Streisand, and I think I don't know. I'm butchering the history. I think there's something about how she didn't want some photos of her house or whatever, and like, you know, her sort of, you know, not wanting media attention to her house sort of had the paradoxical effect of attracting more and more media to her, take images of her house. I don't know if I may be getting that completely wrong, but I think basically in the main summary of the Streisand effect is sort of looking at how if you tell someone don't pay attention to this thing, you know, that will have, you know, the paradoxical effect of attracting more and more attention to this thing. And so, like, particularly in the context of Bitcoin, you know, it's one of them things which is, like, you know, in the past slightly taboo to talk about in economics and finance circles and stuff like that. You tend to get like raised eyebrows and people feel a bit nervous talking about that and stuff. And you know, it's important to think about, you know, a lot of, you know, governments, you know, they don't want really their citizens paying attention to Bitcoin or whatever. And there's this interesting thing about how, you know, if you try and stifle it, try and ban it, regulate it away, you know, that isn't gonna really, that's just gonna, you know, attract more and more attention. More and more people are gonna query into it, start researching it and learning more about it, I suppose. And yeah, I mean banning something doesn't get rid of it, does it? You know, China tried to ban mining a couple of years ago. They just moved to different jurisdictions. You know, the war on drugs, for example, which is something I've talked about, you know, at length on this channel and podcast, and that didn't stop people using drugs. It just, you know, made people use black market and unregulated sort of networks and stuff. So, yeah. And I guess sort of like as an end point to sort of summarize everything, you cannot from the top down, you know, control Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is, I mean, there's no marketing team for it, there's no insiders for it. The developer is anonymous and hasn't moved their wallet of Bitcoin in 15 years. It's very much a bottom-up, emergent revolution, which is important because it doesn't, you know, it doesn't need any particular individual. It's really a voluntary network that people, if they're interested, they start learning more and more about it. And it's a very natural progression resulting from that, and that makes it very, very interesting. But yeah, I hope that's been useful. I'm going to continue to study and learn more about it, and yeah, I hope these are useful for you. Anyways, have a good rest of your day.